A brutal winter leaves roads impassable, cutting off access to stores for weeks. How would you keep your food fresh and your family fed? The Amish have faced challenges like this for generations and have mastered natural methods to preserve meat without refrigeration or chemicals. These methods might just save you one day. Clay or ash coating. Clay and ash coating might sound unconventional, but for the Amish, it's a trusted method for keeping meat fresh without refrigeration. This technique involves covering the meat in a thick layer of clay or ash, creating a natural seal that protects it from air, pests, and bacteria. The coating also helps regulate moisture, keeping the meat tender and flavorful over time. On Amish farms, the clay or ash is often sourced from their own land, ensuring the process remains entirely self-sufficient. After butchering, the meat is coated evenly with the material, forming a protective shell. It's then stored in cool cellars or barns, where the seal keeps it safe from spoilage. When it's time to use the meat, the coating is simply cracked open and brushed off, revealing the perfectly preserved cuts inside. According to one Amish farmer I encountered, he explained, this clay keeps everything out: air, bugs, even sunlight. My grandfather used this method, and his hams were always the best in the county. While sourcing clay or ash might seem daunting, food-grade clay or fine wood ash can work wonders. Begin by ensuring your meat is clean and dry. Coat it thoroughly with the clay or ash, ensuring no part is exposed. Allow the coating to dry and harden, then store the meat in a cool, dark place. When you're ready to eat it, gently remove the coating, rinse the meat, and enjoy the fruits of an ancient preservation method. While sealing meat in a natural barrier of clay or ash is undeniably innovative, the Amish also turned to a centuries-old method that combines preservation with nourishment. This next technique isn't just about keeping meat fresh, it's about creating a compact, high-energy food that can sustain you for months. Let's talk about pemmican. Pemmican. Pemmican is a preservation method that combines practicality with nourishment, making it a favourite among the Amish for long journeys and winter sustenance. This traditional food involves mixing dried, finely ground meat with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries to create a nutrient-dense, compact food that can last for months without refrigeration. The Amish typically start by drying thin strips of lean meat, often venison or beef, until they are brittle. The dried meat is then ground into a powder using hand-crank grinders. Next, rendered animal fat, often from pork or beef, is melted down and combined with the meat powder in equal proportions. For added flavour and nutrients, they might mix in dried blueberries, cranberries, or even a touch of honey. The mixture is then pressed into small cakes or rolled into balls, ready to be stored in jars or wrapped in cloth. To make pemmican at home, start by drying lean cuts of meat such as beef, venison, or bison. Slice the meat thinly and dry it in a dehydrator or oven set to 150 degrees until it becomes brittle, a process that can take 12 to 24 hours. Once dried, grind the meat into a fine powder using a food processor or hand grinder. Render animal fat by slowly heating it until it melts, then strain out any impurities. Combine the powdered meat and melted fat in equal parts, adding finely chopped dried berries or a drizzle of honey for extra flavour if desired. Mix well, then press the mixture into moulds or shape it into compact balls. Allow the pemmican to cool and harden before storing it in airtight containers or wrapping it in parchment. Kept in a cool, dry place, pemmican remains shelf-stable for months and provides a concentrated source of energy and nutrition. Pemmican may be a survivalist's dream, but when it comes to flavour, nothing beats the smoky richness of cured meat. Smoking combined with curing, the perfect pair for long-lasting meat. I once stood outside a working Amish smokehouse, watching wisps of applewood smoke curl into the crisp autumn air. The farmer opened the door to reveal rows of sausages and slabs of bacon, each one glistening with a rich, smoky sheen. "We smoke for flavour," he told me, "but the curing, that's what keeps it safe." Combining smoking with curing is a technique the Amish have perfected over generations. By salting the meat first and then exposing it to smoke, they ensure the meat is not only preserved, but also imbued with a deep, smoky flavour that's impossible to resist. This dual process creates a protective barrier against bacteria and enhances the meat's texture and taste. To try this method, start by rubbing your meat with salt and spices, and let it cure in a cool place for a few days. Next, set up a smoker or use a grill with a smoking box. Choose hardwoods like hickory or apple for the best results, and smoke the meat at a low temperature, 150 to 200 degrees Celsius, for several hours. The combination of curing and smoking will not only preserve your meat, but also give it a flavour that rivals anything from a professional smokehouse. Speaking of enhancing flavour while preserving meat, the Amish have another trick up their sleeves: sugar curing. Sugar curing. For the Amish, sugar curing is a time-honoured method that combines practicality with rich, flavourful results. This process involves using a mixture of sugar and salt to draw out moisture from the meat, creating an environment where bacteria struggle to survive. The added sweetness of the sugar not only enhances the flavour, but also gives the cured meat a caramelised aroma that's utterly irresistible. The process starts with fresh cuts of meat, often pork or beef, which are generously coated in a curing mixture. This blend typically includes sugar, salt, and sometimes additional spices like cloves or black pepper for added depth. The meat is then placed in a cool, dark area, often inside wooden barrels or ceramic crocks, where it is allowed to cure over the course of several days or weeks. The sugar and salt work together to draw out moisture while infusing the meat with a balanced, savoury sweet flavour. To sugar cure meat at home, start by mixing equal parts sugar and salt, adjusting the ratio to suit your taste. Add optional spices like paprika, garlic powder, or cloves for extra flavour. Rub the mixture generously over the meat, ensuring every surface is coated. Place the meat in a shallow dish or wrap it in butcher paper, then store it in the refrigerator or a cool, dark space for 5 to 7 days. During this time, the curing mixture will draw out moisture, forming a flavourful brine. Once cured, rinse off the excess sugar and salt, pat the meat dry, and cook or store it as desired. The result is tender, flavourful meat with a touch of sweetness that pays homage to Amish tradition. I once visited an Amish farmhouse during the curing season and watched as a family carefully rubbed their freshly butchered pork with a golden-hued mixture of brown sugar and salt. The mother explained, "This method has been in our family for generations. It's simple, but the taste, it's something you never forget." If sugar curing adds sweetness, brining keeps it simple with salt and water. This straightforward method has been a cornerstone of Amish preservation for generations. Brining. For the Amish, brining is one of the most dependable methods for preserving meat. The technique involves submerging whole cuts of pork, beef or poultry in a saltwater solution for several days or even weeks. This not only prevents bacteria from growing, but also tenderizes the meat and infuses it with a savoury flavour that modern refrigeration just can't replicate. Imagine stepping into an Amish smokehouse, where barrels of brined meat are lined up neatly, ready to be smoked or cooked. The brining process starts with preparing the solution, a mix of water, coarse salt, and sometimes sugar or spices like cloves, bay leaves, and garlic. The meat is fully submerged in the brine, ensuring every part absorbs the mixture evenly. Over time, the salt works its magic, drawing out moisture while infusing the meat with robust flavour. I remember visiting an Amish farm during butchering season and seeing this process firsthand. The farmer's wife was stirring a large wooden barrel of brine, the aroma of spices filling the air. "This keeps our meat fresh for weeks," she explained, "and it gives it a taste that no freezer can match." To brine meat, begin by preparing a solution using water and coarse salt, typically 1 cup of salt per gallon of water, along with optional flavourings like sugar, garlic or peppercorns. Heat the mixture gently to dissolve the salt, then let it cool completely. Place your chosen cut of meat into a non-reactive container, ensuring it is fully submerged in the brine. If needed, use a weight to keep the meat beneath the surface. Store the container in a cool place or refrigerator for several days, with larger cuts requiring up to 2 weeks. Once brined, rinse the meat thoroughly to remove excess salt, then cook, smoke or roast it as desired. The result is tender, flavourful meat that reflects the timeless wisdom of Amish preservation techniques. Brining may be simple, but fermentation takes things to the next level, blending science with tradition to preserve meat while unlocking bold, tasty flavours. Fermentation. For the Amish, fermentation isn't just a way to preserve meat. It's a culinary art form steeped in tradition. Picture an Amish family gathered in their kitchen, working together to prepare cuts of pork or beef for the fermentation process. Earthenware crocks, often handed down through generations, line the counter, ready to transform simple ingredients into something extraordinary. The process begins with freshly butchered meat, carefully rubbed with a mixture of salt and hand-ground spices like garlic, black pepper, and sometimes a hint of nutmeg. These flavours aren't chosen randomly. They reflect family recipes perfected over decades. Once seasoned, the meat is packed tightly into crocks, eliminating any air pockets where natural bacteria work their magic, breaking down sugars and creating lactic acid. This environment not only preserves the meat, but also develops a tangy, complex flavour that modern methods simply can't replicate. To do this by yourself at home, start with fresh, high-quality cuts of pork or beef. Rub them generously with a mix of coarse salt and your choice of spices. Use a clean, sterilised crock or glass container and layer the meat tightly to remove any air gaps. Cover the meat with a weight, like a plate or a sterilised stone, to keep it submerged. Store it in a cool, dark place for 1 to 2 weeks, checking periodically to ensure no mould forms on the surface. Once fermented, the meat can be stored in its own brine in the refrigerator or a cold cellar. The result is a flavourful, preserved product that connects you to a centuries-old tradition. Watching this unfold in an Amish kitchen is mesmerising. There's a quiet rhythm to their work, each person knowing exactly what to do. I once visited a family during their fermentation day, and I remember being struck by how effortless they made it seem. The aroma of spices filled the room, and the older generation shared stories of how this same process sustained their ancestors through long winters. Fermentation transforms meat with its tasty complexity, but spiced rubs show how a simpler approach can be just as powerful. Spiced rubs. During one of my visits to an Amish farm, I watched a family prepare a batch of spiced cured ham. The air was thick with the warm, earthy aroma of cinnamon and cloves. "This is my grandmother's recipe," the farmer's wife explained, sprinkling the final layer of spice onto a cut of pork. "It's kept our family well fed for generations." For the Amish, preserving meat is as much about flavour as it is about practicality, and spiced rubs are one of their most cherished methods. The process involves coating meat with a blend of herbs and spices known for their natural antimicrobial properties. Walk into an Amish kitchen and you'll likely see cuts of pork or beef laid out on large wooden tables, being carefully rubbed with a fragrant mix of garlic, cloves and cinnamon. These spices not only protect the meat, but also infuse it with a rich, complex flavour. The Amish often create their rubs using freshly ground spices, a task that might involve a hand-crank grinder or a well-worn mortar and pestle. Each family has its own secret recipe, with certain spices chosen for their preservative qualities and others for their ability to enhance taste. Once the meat is thoroughly coated, it's either hung to dry or stored in cool cellars, allowing the spices to work their magic over time. You can replicate this method by creating your own spice blend using antimicrobial ingredients like garlic powder, black pepper, and ground cloves. Rub the mixture generously over fresh cuts of meat, ensuring every surface is coated. Let the meat rest in a cool, well-ventilated area for a few days, or store it in a fridge if needed. The result is meat that's not only preserved, but also bursting with flavour. Herbs play a starring role in spiced rubs, but they're equally important in the Amish practice of drying meat. Pairing dehydration with aromatic herbs creates a method that's as flavourful as it is effective. Dehydration with herbs. In Amish kitchens, preserving meat through dehydration is often elevated by the addition of herbs, turning a practical task into an art form. Herbs like rosemary, thyme, and sage, chosen for their natural antibacterial properties, are carefully combined with thin strips of meat to extend its shelf life while infusing it with a rich, earthy flavour. Walk into a drying shed on an Amish farm, and you'll likely see rows of meat strips glistening with oils and dotted with freshly crushed herbs, gently drying in the warm air. The process starts with cutting meat into thin, uniform strips to ensure even drying. Each strip is coated in a mixture of salt, finely chopped herbs, and sometimes a touch of oil or vinegar to enhance preservation. The Amish often hang these strips in well-ventilated spaces, such as barns or special drying sheds, where the combination of airflow and time does the rest. During cooler seasons, drying might take place near a wood-burning stove, taking advantage of gentle, consistent heat. I remember standing in one such barn, the scent of rosemary mingling with the faint smokiness of drying meat. The farmer told me, "These herbs don't just keep the meat fresh, they make it taste better too. It's like a recipe that gets passed down along with the tradition." His pride was evident as he checked each strip, ensuring it was drying perfectly. To replicate this method at home, start by selecting lean cuts of meat such as beef, venison or turkey, and carefully trim away any fat to prevent spoilage during the drying process. Slice the meat into thin strips about 1 to 4 inch thick to ensure even drying and consistent results. Next, prepare a herb blend by combining salt with dried or fresh herbs like rosemary, thyme, sage or oregano. For added preservation and flavour, consider incorporating garlic powder, onion powder or black pepper into the mix. Generously rub the herb mixture onto each strip of meat, ensuring every surface is thoroughly coated. Once seasoned, hang the strips in a clean, well-ventilated area to dry. If a traditional drying shed isn't available, you can use a food dehydrator set to 140 degrees Celsius or your oven at its lowest temperature, with the door slightly open to allow airflow. Monitor the drying process closely. The meat should become leathery yet pliable, a process that typically takes 6 to 12 hours, depending on humidity and the thickness of the slices. After drying, store the meat properly to maintain its quality. Place the strips in airtight containers, vacuum-sealed bags, or glass jars with desiccants to keep moisture out. This method not only significantly extends the shelf life of your meat, but also infuses it with the rich aroma and flavour of your chosen herbs, making it a practical and delicious preservation technique. Where drying removes moisture to preserve meat, pickling does the opposite, using a tasty brine to protect and flavour meat for long-term storage. Pickling. Pickling meat might sound unusual to some, But for the Amish, it's a beloved technique that combines practicality with flavour. Imagine walking into an Amish root cellar and finding jars of pickled pork or beef, their brine glistening in the dim light. These jars represent more than food. They're a symbol of ingenuity and careful planning. The pickling process begins with a brine made from water, salt, vinegar, and a blend of spices. Each family has its own recipe, with ingredients like cloves, mustard seeds, or even a touch of honey to balance the flavours. The meat is submerged in the brine, where the acidity works to preserve it. Once sealed in jars, the pickled meat is stored in cool cellars, ready to be enjoyed months later. My first encounter with pickled meat in an Amish home was unforgettable. The heady scent of vinegar and spices greeted me as the matriarch proudly opened a jar. "This batch has been curing since last fall," she said, serving slices alongside freshly baked bread. The flavour was unlike anything I'd tasted before, sharp, savoury, and deeply satisfying. To pickle meat, begin by making a brine. Boil a mixture of water, kosher salt, and white or apple cider vinegar. Add spices such as bay leaves, peppercorns, and mustard seeds for added flavour. Once cooled, pour the brine over cooked or raw meat packed in sterilised jars, ensuring the meat is fully submerged. Seal the jars tightly and store them in a cool, dark place for 7 to 14 days. Always taste test a small portion before consuming larger amounts. Properly pickled meat is not only safe to eat, but also a flavourful addition to your pantry. Pickling is a great way to preserve fresh produce, but when it comes to meats, the Amish have another ingenious solution: sealing food in lard. Lard sealing. The first time I saw lard sealing in action, I was struck by its simplicity. There's something almost magical about the way this humble ingredient transforms into a protective barrier. The Amish make it look effortless, but the truth is it takes a keen eye to get it just right. The lard has to be poured at just the right temperature to avoid gaps or cracks, and the meat must be packed tightly to maximise storage. Lard sealing might sound like an old-fashioned technique, but for the Amish, it's as essential today as it was a century ago. Picture an Amish kitchen, bustling with activity as freshly cooked pork or sausage is carefully packed into earthenware crocks. Once the meat is nestled in, warm, rendered lard is poured over it, creating a thick, creamy seal. As the lard cools and solidifies, it locks out air, preserving the meat for months without refrigeration. Many Amish families raise their own pigs, ensuring the lard they use comes straight from their farm. Nothing goes to waste. The same animal that provides the meat also provides the preservative. In some communities, this process becomes a family event, with children helping to stir the lard while grandparents share stories of their own canning days. For anyone curious about trying this at home, the process is surprisingly straightforward. After cooking your meat, pack it into a heat-safe container like a mason jar or crock. Then melt high-quality lard until it's fully liquid and pour it over the meat, ensuring complete coverage. Once the lard cools and hardens, store the container in a cool, dark place. When it's time to use the meat, simply scrape off the lard and enjoy. What makes lard sealing so remarkable is its versatility and sustainability. For the Amish, it's not just about preserving meat, it's about living in harmony with the resources they have. Once you've mastered lard sealing, rendering and preserving in fat becomes a natural next step. Rendering and preserving in fat, the Amish art of sealing freshness. The Amish have a knack for turning simple techniques into time-tested solutions, and rendering meat in fat is a perfect example. This method, often called confit, involves cooking meat and then submerging it in its own rendered fat, creating an airtight seal that locks in both freshness and flavour. Imagine the sight of an Amish kitchen on butchering day, pots of simmering fat, jars being carefully packed and the faint aroma of slow-cooked pork wafting through the air. The process begins with cooking the meat, typically pork or duck, over low heat until it's tender and flavourful. Once cooked, the meat is packed tightly into crocks or jars and warm, liquid fat, often rendered from the same animal, is poured over it. As the fat cools and solidifies, it forms an airtight seal that protects the meat from spoilage. This preserved meat can then be stored for months, ready to be pulled out for hearty meals during winter or busy harvest seasons. To try this method, cook your meat slowly in its own fat or another suitable oil until tender. Pack the meat tightly into sterilised jars and pour the hot fat over it until fully submerged. Let the fat cool and solidify before sealing the jars. Store them in a cool, dark place. When ready to use, simply scrape off the fat, and you'll find the meat as flavourful and tender as the day it was packed. I have watched a family prepare a batch of preserved pork. The grandmother stirred the bubbling pot of fat while her grandson carefully layered the cooked meat into jars. She told me with a smile, "This was how we survived the long winters when I was a girl. No refrigeration, just good fat and hard work." Preserving in fat is perfect for many foods, but salt curing is another timeless technique that the Amish use to keep meats and fish ready to eat for a very long time. Salt curing. Imagine this. Freshly butchered pork or beef is laid out, and instead of rushing to freeze it, the Amish carefully rub coarse salt into every inch. They understand that preserving meat isn't about haste, it's about precision. Using large, wooden tables in well-ventilated spaces, they ensure the salt penetrates the meat evenly, drawing out moisture and creating an inhospitable environment for spoilage. For the Amish, salt isn't just a preservative, it's a symbol of resilience. Many Amish families have their own unique tweaks to the curing process, often blending in spices like cloves or black pepper to add flavour. Some even use hand-crank grinders to prepare the salt mixture, a small but significant detail that reflects their commitment to self-reliance. Preserving meat with salt is one of the oldest and most effective methods known to humanity, and the Amish have perfected it as part of their commitment to self-sufficient living. At its core, salt curing is about removing moisture from meat, a critical step to prevent bacteria from thriving. The Amish approach this method not just as a chore, but as a craft, rooted in centuries of tradition. In Amish communities, curing meat is often a group activity, bringing together families to work and share stories. There's a sense of camaraderie and continuity, a shared understanding that these practices are vital for their way of life. The finished product isn't just food, it's a testament to their craftsmanship and patience. If you're inspired by the Amish method of salt curing, you can bring a bit of their wisdom into your own kitchen. Start with high-quality, fresh meat and coarse salt. Lay the meat on a non-reactive surface, such as a wooden board or stainless steel tray, and coat it generously with salt. Take your time with this step. Channel the same care the Amish put into their work. Ensure every surface, nook and cranny is covered, and place the meat in a cool, dry place. Over the next few days, check the meat regularly to drain any liquid that the salt extracts. Once cured, the meat can be stored in an airtight container or wrapped in parchment, just as the Amish would store it in their root cellars or pantries. My first encounter with Amish salt curing left a lasting impression. Watching them work, the precision, the teamwork, the respect for tradition, I couldn't help but admire their resourcefulness. In a world increasingly reliant on electricity, salt curing offers a sustainable alternative. For preppers or those living off-grid, it's a technique that ensures food security in the face of uncertainty. And even for those with access to modern conveniences, there's something deeply satisfying about mastering such an ancient art. While salt curing draws out moisture and extends shelf life, smoking adds a layer of flavour and protection that transforms basic preservation into a culinary art. Smoking. For the Amish, smoking meat is more than a way to enhance flavour. It's one of their major preservation practices. This method ensures meat remains edible for months, even up to a year, making it an essential skill for self-sufficient living. Step into an Amish kitchen and you'll often see smoked hams, sausages, and slabs of bacon suspended from rafters, the smoky aroma still clinging to the air. The process of smoking involves more than simply exposing meat to smoke. It's a delicate balance of science and tradition. First, the Amish prepare their meat by seasoning it generously with a blend of salt and spices. This initial step not only enhances flavour, but also helps draw out moisture, a key factor in preventing spoilage. The meat is then hung in a smokehouse, a small wooden structure specifically designed for this purpose, where it's exposed to controlled heat and smoke for several hours or even days. What sets Amish smoking apart is their meticulous attention to detail. They select specific types of wood, such as hickory or apple, each imparting a distinct flavour profile to the meat. Hickory lends a bold, hearty taste, while applewood infuses a sweeter, milder note. These choices aren't random. They reflect a deep understanding of how smoke interacts with the meat. The smokehouse itself is a marvel of simplicity and efficiency. It's designed to maintain a steady flow of heat and smoke, creating an environment where bacteria find it difficult to thrive. This combination of reduced moisture, heat, and smoke not only preserves the meat, but also imbues it with a richness that modern preservation methods simply can't replicate. I once tried smoking meat at home, inspired by the Amish process. Let's just say it didn't go quite as planned. The aroma wafting through my yard quickly attracted neighbours who came over expecting a backyard bonfire party, not an experimental batch of smoked ribs. In contrast, the Amish approach this practice with the precision of a seasoned artisan. They know exactly how long to smoke each cut and at what temperature, ensuring the result is consistently excellent. For those looking to replicate this method, smoking meat at home can be a rewarding endeavour. Start by selecting the right cut of meat and seasoning it thoroughly with salt and spices. If you have access to a smoker or a makeshift smokehouse, use hardwoods like hickory, apple, or cherry for the best results. Keep the temperature steady, between 150 degree and 200 degrees heat, and allow the meat to smoke slowly over several hours. Patience is key. The longer the process, the richer the flavour. In an emergency or off-grid situation, smoking becomes more than just a culinary adventure. It's a survival skill. The Amish have long relied on this method to maintain their food supply without refrigeration, proving its effectiveness in preserving both flavour and nutrition. Preservation isn't just about tradition, it's also about practicality. That's where pressure canning steps in, giving the Amish a way to store everything from vegetables to soups in airtight jars. Pressure canning. My first time seeing Amish pressure canning up close was eye-opening. Watching an entire family work together, from trimming the meat to timing the canner, felt like stepping into a bygone era. There's a quiet rhythm to the process. Each person knows their role, and they move with practiced efficiency. At the end of the day, the pantry shelves grow fuller, a tangible reward for their labour. For the Amish, pressure canning is more than just a method of preserving meat. It's a cornerstone of their self-sufficient lifestyle. Walk into an Amish pantry and you'll find rows of meticulously labelled jars filled with rich, flavourful cuts of chicken, beef or venison. These jars aren't just food. They're a testament to the hard work and careful planning that goes into preparing for months, even years, without refrigeration. The process begins right after butchering. Fresh cuts of meat are trimmed, seasoned, and carefully packed into sterilised jars. These aren't your average store-bought jars. Many have been passed down through generations, their history etched into the scratches and wear of the glass. The jars are then placed in a pressure canner, which the Amish often power with gas or wood-burning stoves. The canner creates a vacuum seal under high pressure, ensuring the meat is safely preserved while retaining its flavour and texture. It's a dance of precision. Too little pressure and bacteria might survive. Too much, and the jars could crack. For the Amish, pressure canning is about more than food security. It's a connection to their values of independence and resourcefulness. Whether it's ensuring the family has enough meat to last through a harsh winter or preparing for emergencies, this method is a lifeline. And the best part? When you open a jar months later, the meat inside tastes as fresh and tender as the day it was canned. If you're inspired to try pressure canning at home, start with quality meat and invest in a reliable pressure canner. Follow safety guidelines closely. The Amish understand better than anyone that precision is key. And while you may not have a family smokehouse or a wood stove, you can still bring a bit of their ingenuity into your kitchen. Finally, we arrive at the backbone of Amish food preservation: root cellar storage. Root cellar storage. For the Amish, a root cellar isn't just a place to store vegetables, it's an essential space for preserving meat in a way that's as practical as it is ingenious. Step into an Amish root cellar and you'll notice the earthy coolness that hugs you immediately. Hanging from wooden beams are cured hams and sausages, wrapped in cloth or paper, quietly aging to perfection. These underground storage spaces are designed to maintain a steady temperature, creating an ideal environment for extending the shelf life of meat without modern refrigeration. The process starts with cured meat, often salted, smoked or brined cuts that have already been prepped for long-term storage. The Amish take great care in wrapping the meat, sometimes using muslin or parchment, which protects it from dirt while allowing airflow. The meats are then hung or placed on wooden shelves in the cool, dark cellar. These spaces are dug deep into the ground, where the temperature remains consistent, often around 35-40 degrees Celsius, even during hot summers. If you don't have a root cellar, you can replicate the concept by using a basement or garage that maintains a cool temperature. Wrap your cured meats in breathable material like muslin and hang them in a dark, well-ventilated space. Keep a thermometer handy to ensure the temperature stays between 32 degrees and 40 degrees. This method not only preserves the meat but also enhances its flavour over time, offering a taste of Amish ingenuity. I once visited an Amish root cellar on a chilly October morning. The cellar was lined with shelves stacked with jars, potatoes and squash, but my eyes were drawn to the row of glistening hams hanging near the back. The farmer told me, "These hams were cured last winter and they'll be ready just in time for Christmas." Hearing the pride in his voice made me realize how this simple practice is more than just functional. It's a tradition steeped in care and foresight.